Hi everyone, I'm military genealogist Simon Pearce. And have you ever been stuck in your military family research and the records just aren't helping you to break down that brick wall? Well, in this video, we are joined by a very special guest indeed, genetic genealogist, my colleague, friend Laura House, who's going to show us how she is using DNA to break down brick walls in military research. Laura, welcome to Forces War Records.
Thank you so much for having me, Simon.
Laura, for anyone that hasn't met you before and isn't familiar with your work, would you mind telling us a bit about you and what you do at Ancestry?
Yeah, of course. So I work for Genealogists, which is the research arm of Ancestry, and we take clients who, for example, might have signed up for Ancestry and started doing their family tree, but then hit a part in the research process where it becomes really difficult, and they need to ask for someone professional to help them out with the research. So my particular role is I'm a senior genetic genealogist, and I take the vast majority of the cases where you can't solve it without DNA. So these are cases like adoptions, where people don't know one or both of their biological parents, or people who've grown up with an unknown father, or sometimes a more distant ancestor in the tree who was born under the same circumstances. And in those cases, there's usually no record of the relationship. So DNA is the only way to solve it.
And I'm so lucky that I get to draw on your knowledge in the office. And sometimes, I feel a bit bad kind of sidling up to your desk and say, Laura, about my DNA results. And I've got this tricky case and it's amazing. For anyone watching at home, I am so lucky to be able to draw on Laura's knowledge. And we're going to touch on that today in this video. But at Forces War Records, we love military research. We love military family history. And I know that you get a lot of military cases in your day-to-day work, Laura. And I hear this a lot in our monthly Facebook Live Q&A. We have people that tell us that they were born to a serviceman during the Second World War, or they think they were, or their grandparents were. It's a really common question, and so I thought, who is the best person that I can ask about this? And Laura, I would love to hear, and I'm sure the community and those watching would love to hear, what kind of work do you do, and could you give us some examples of the cases that you work on? Because it's such a fascinating area, and yeah, we're all ears. We'd love to hear about your work in this area and how DNA is helping you to break down those brick walls.
Yeah, it's like you say, it's a really common situation, and a huge number of my clients are people who were conceived during the Second World War. There were 3 million GIs from the United States who passed through the UK during the Second World War. So
Mm.
this was an enormous volume of men. And of course, the women's husbands were often away. For those who were married, the women's husbands were away at war for many years. Some of the women were single. The men were away from their wives. Some of the men were single. And so relationships formed and women became pregnant, and sometimes there was nothing they could do to track the man down in order to tell him about the baby. And in some cases, of course, as we know, this happens, the men weren't interested. And so there were many, many women who had babies during the Second World War, and those children were often never told who their biological father was, because this was an era where if you ever talk to someone who grew up during this time and you say to them, did you ever find out who your father was? They'll say, we didn't ask those questions. It wouldn't have been appropriate for us to ask those questions. Or if I did ask that question, I was told, we're not going to talk about that. And so many people grew up with absolutely no information about who their biological father was. And we get a lot of clients who have had this experience, and the outcome varies massively, and it's a surprising number of people who come to us having been told by an aunt or someone in the family that their dad was an American GI.
Hmm.
And then we discover he was a soldier, but he lived up the road from their mum. He was British, and he was just a next door neighbor. So it's interesting how often it turns out to be a local man. But these stories that come from the relatives end up being a little bit more embellished than the
Mm.
reality. So one thing that I often say to our clients is whatever story you're coming to us with, be ready that the truth may differ from that story. So people are often very attached to the story that was given to them. Whatever scraps of information they got from their family, they get very attached to it. But you want to go into the search with a completely open mind.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to touch on some of your key tips for anyone watching who might be in this position later. But I love the fact that you bring up a really important point of, 3 million American GIs that passed through Britain during the war. You've got over 300,000 Canadians. And then, you look alone at those that were from Britain, from, you know, stationed all around the country, away from their homes in different parts of the country, training before being shipped out or to wherever. People did mix. They mix with the local communities, they mix with the women in the ATS, in the NAFI. You've got this bringing together of communities, of cultures, of men and women, it was an exciting time, but I can imagine for many as well, you didn't know, am I going to come back? Am I ever going to see my home again? And yeah, these relationships did formed, and as you mentioned, Laura, sometimes it often turns out to be, someone from up the road, and there are clues perhaps in there, and also, I guess, a lot of women may have married after the war, and their partners may have taken on the child, or the child may have grown up thinking that was their father, and you're right, a different generation, people didn't ask these questions, but with the advent of DNA and ancestry DNA, it's helping us to break down these brick walls. And would you mind just giving us an insight into, how you're using DNA to break down these military mysteries, if you like?
The way that we use DNA in these sorts of cases is, of course, to start with, the person who's looking for their biological father or their granddad or great granddad takes an ancestry DNA test, and then we look at the DNA matches of that person. That's our primary resource. So when you take an ancestry DNA test, you're matched with every person in the database with whom you share a meaningful amount of DNA. So essentially, you're given a list of all your genetic relatives in the database. And 50% of those are from your unknown biological father. Or if it's your grandparent, 25% of those are from your unknown grandparent. And this is the powerhouse of genetic genealogy. We look at the matches that belong to that unknown part of the family, and we look at the ancestors they share with each other. And then once we've identified the ancestors those matches share with each other, we hypothesize that those are the client's ancestors. And then we trace down until we reach the Second World War generation, and we look at all the men in that generation. And that's when the documentary side of things comes into play. That's more your remit, Simon.
Well, I was going to say, I can't wait to get stuck into the records as well. And I know that, on Forces War Records, we have a huge number of Second World War records, not least the medal cards, which, released a couple of years ago. And I'm sure you've had a chance to delve into, Laura, because these are the little clues that the medal cards provide, the name, the number, the unit, the medals that they were entitled to. There's clues there that can help you with the research. But when you're doing this kind of research and you're trying to identify a serviceman and put a name to or a face or a service history to the name, what kind of records are you touching on when you do this?
The best records are records of service because what we
Mm.
really want to know is where the man was around the time of conception. And so any record that gives us dates and locations is ideal. And so the some of the newly released UK service records have been fantastic because
Oh
if you're
yeah.
really lucky, you hit one that's got all of the locations and dates, and you can see that the serviceman was in London in at exactly the time that the child was conceived, and the child was conceived in London, and then you're like, okay, this is interesting. And
It's
so that
matching
gives
up.
you a really good lead to work on them because you can move forward with a bit more confidence, or you can rule people out as well. And I had a case recently where the man who I thought might be the dad was stationed in France at the time of conception. There's no evidence that he was in the UK at the time. And so
Mm.
actually, I've sort of shelved him for now and we're focusing on someone else instead. So it's also really useful for saying, actually, it's really unlikely that this man is the biological father, and we're going to look instead at someone else in the family who might have been a better candidate.
I love that you touch on the service records, Laura, because they're so valuable. And if you're watching at home and a service record is like the holy grail of military research. It tells you when someone enlisted, who they served with, where they served, right down to if they were wounded, when they trained. But as Laura touches on, it tells you where they were at a certain point. And so for the Second World War British Army, the service and casualty form, that page there is going to help you piece together someone's movements and tell you where they were, as Laura points out, at the time of conception. And many are being digitized. We used to have to order them from the Ministry of Defence. They've now been transferred to the National Archives, and Ancestry is digitizing them. And they already have a huge number available on Ancestry, and we're going to keep digitizing them as time goes on. So have a look on Ancestry if you're looking for a Second World War service record. Have a look because that could be a really good starting point. You can piece together your ancestors' journey there. But are there any, and I appreciate, there's only so many, specifics you can go into, Laura, and this is very personal cases, people, this is real people. These are, their lives. But are there any cases that stand out to you that you can touch on? And I appreciate you may have to be, a bit more vague, but with the names. But is there anything that stands out or any that have been really rewarding to you in your time of doing this kind of research?
Well, I can talk about a case from my own family,
Oh,
which
wow.
I wrote an article about and published it, so it's already public information, so we can talk about that. And this is part of the phenomenon of what is referred to as Britain's brown babies, which is during the Second World War, about 250,000 African American GIs were stationed in the UK at various points. And there were governmental policies between the United States and the UK that stated that African American soldiers were to be discouraged from spending any time with white British women. And this did nothing to actually prevent relationships from forming, but what it did do was massively stigmatize those relationships. About 2,000 babies were born to African American GIs and white British women during the Second World War. And the vast majority of those babies never got to meet their fathers because the army interceded in the relationship between the
Mm.
father and the mother. And if the father asked for permission to marry the mother, he was then sent away from the country. And the woman was told either that he didn't exist, that he'd made up his name, or that he wasn't interested in a relationship with her. So these women were lied to about the men who they had relationships with. Oftentimes, these men wanted to get married, and the women were told the opposite. And then the child grew up thinking the opposite as well. And so families were destroyed by this. So 2,000 babies were born under these circumstances, and then the African American press actually caught on to what was happening in the UK, and they investigated this. So African American journalists came to the UK and they investigated what was happening, and they dubbed it Britain's brown babies. So there were all these headlines in the African American press about Britain's brown babies, and they estimated it to be closer to 1,000 children that were born during this time. But nowadays we know there were more like 2,000 children. So it was a huge scandal and actually the scandal broke in the UK a few years ago when this information became public. So the scandal broke in the UK a few years ago because the records had been classified and then it became public and people realized that the government had played such a huge role in splitting these families apart
Mm.
and breaking up these relationships. And so now there are a lot of people who are looking for the truth. And I have a cousin who was born under these circumstances. So my great aunt Annie became pregnant by an African American soldier during the Second World War, and she had a baby, and the baby was called Jessie Harris. And Jessie Harris had a very difficult childhood. She wasn't treated well by the family, she wasn't treated well by the community. Eventually, she was adopted out and changed her name to Diana. And her whole life was difficult. She had a long, not a long, but she had many, many difficult years growing up in London and then living in Birmingham. And I tried to track her down using documents, and I was having absolutely no luck whatsoever. And then one day I got an Ancestry DNA match, and it was Diana's granddaughter. And so this woman who came up in my Ancestry DNA matches, she'd never met her grandma, but between us we figured it out that her grandma was my missing cousin, Diana. So we pieced it together. It took us a while. We were like, "Oh, is this the connection?" And then we looked at all our shared matches, and then she showed me the information she had, and I showed her the information I had. So I had
Oh,
pictures of Diana as a little girl, and she had stories about Diana's later years, and together we pieced together this was the same woman. And it wasn't the story of Diana was not a happy one. If you read the article, you'll learn about her story. It didn't end well. She died very young under tragic circumstances. But using DNA, her granddaughter and I were able to piece together the story of her life and to connect the early years of her life with the later years of her life. And recently, this cousin of mine, who's Diana's granddaughter, she got a new DNA match who is related to Diana's biological father. So now we have the starting point of the information we need to figure out who this man was, who was Diana's biological father, and what was the story there, and what were his circumstances, and what was his story, and who did he go on to be, and did he have other children, and
yeah.
how did his life end? So this is this whole missing part of Diana's story that we're finally going to have the opportunity to fill in those gaps. And yeah, that's one I can talk about because it's my own cousin, yeah.
Oh, that's that moment when the notification came through on the DNA match must have been so poignant and exciting and just this mix of emotions because it breaks down as you were saying, it breaks down these bricks walls. The records are incredible. I mean, service records, medal cards, casualty records, but sometimes they can't help us to bridge this gap. And I can only imagine how exciting that was when the alert came through that you had a new match and just
Oh,
yeah.
yeah. It was fantastic. She's the same age as me as well, so it was really nice to have a
Mm.
research buddy who's my age. It was the day after my birthday. I remember it really well. It was the day after my birthday, and I got
Ah.
the new DNA match. And I had a feeling when I looked at our shared matches that she was going to be related to Diana because of the we had all the matches from that part of our family. And yeah, it was fantastic. And she was really keen to learn more. And she was a fantastic research partner as well. She was so brilliant. And between us, we made more progress in the next few months than I had searching for years. So it was really good having that extra help.
Wow. And then you never know, the family may have photographs or service history of the father and just, what's his story? Where did he serve? Where did he go? What did he experience? These stories, there are family stories. It's so important to keep them alive and, pass them on to future generations. And Laura, for anyone watching, and I appreciate there's probably many tips, but do you have three tips that you could give, for anyone in this situation who, yeah, what could they do?
Three tips. Okay. So my first tip would be to go into the search with an open mind. There's something that a trap that a lot of people fall into when they do the search. It's called confirmation bias. And it's when you've been given a piece of information and you become quite emotionally attached to that information, often because it's all you have. So let's say, for example, that you were told that your father was a American GI named Stephen, and that's the only thing you ever had your whole life, the only information you ever had. You might go into the search looking for an American GI called Stephen, but that can lead you astray because if that's not his name and if that's not his identity, you'll be looking for the wrong person. So even though it can be really difficult to let go of what you think you know, I would go into the search with a completely open mind and you're looking for whoever he may be rather than a specific person with a specific identity. My second tip would be to focus on the DNA matches and what the DNA matches tell you. So again, rather than looking for Stephen, look at your DNA matches and sort them into groups, into family groups, find the group that relates to that unknown ancestor and look at what that information is telling you rather than what you think you know, what you think you want to find. My third tip would be if you get to a point where you feel like you're hitting a wall, there's no shame in asking for some help. And there are many people out there, DNA experts, who offer help for free, help and advice. And you can go to them and you can ask for some help and some advice. And you only ask for three, but a cheeky fourth tip would be just don't give up. Keep
Hmm.
checking in with your Ancestry DNA results. Even if you're not getting anything at first, new matches are coming in all the time. So keep checking back in.
Those are fantastic, Laura. Thank you. And as you pointed out as well, the service record, in terms of the records, if you are able to identify this individual or have a candidate, get hold of their service record. May well be on Ancestry already. If not, it'll be at the National Archives or with the MOD. And yeah, that's the page. These are the records that can help you understand their movements, what they were doing. And if you have a photograph in your collection, because this may be rarer, but if you do have a photo, perhaps, Laura, you may have had cases in the past where someone has a photo and that's all they have to go on and they believe this is their father, or maybe it's a grandfather. Look at the uniform, look at badges, look at patches, at rank patches, little clues that can help you when it comes to looking in the records. And I wish you all, everyone watching, if you're in this situation, the best of luck because it's as you probably found, or it's challenging, and maybe you don't always get the positive result that you want, and it is challenging. It can take years, but as you found in your own family as well, that it can be rewarding when it pays off and when you do break down that brick wall. And I can speak to you for hours, Laura, because you are so interesting and the work you do is so incredible and valuable. And thank you so much for joining us on Forces War Records. We're really lucky to have you here to give us a glimpse and an insight into the kind of work you do. So thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Simon. It's been great.
And thanks everyone who's taken the time to watch. Good luck with your military research, and we'll do this all again soon. Thanks, everyone.